So we talked about destructuring arrays, but we can also destructure objects. So let's do that now. And this time, let's actually write the code before the previous lecture. So right here after this restaurant object, so that we don't have to scroll too much. Also, I added this object here to the restaurant object. And so that was already in your starter files, but I didn't have it here yet. Anyway, let's now talk about object destructuring. And so to do that, we use the curly braces to destructure. So to destructure objects, we use the curly braces, because this is also how we create objects, right? Then all we have to do is to provide the variable names that exactly match the property names that we want to retrieve from the object. So the obvious choice here of object to destructure is restaurant. So let's take the name, categories, and opening hours. So again, let's start with const in order to actually define some variable names. And now, as I said, we need to write the exact property names here to now extract variables from this object. Now, since in an object the order of elements does not matter, we don't need to manually skip elements like we did in an array. So we can simply write name, so that's the restaurant name here, and then also remember that in objects the order of the elements does not matter. And so we can also then take now the opening hours, which is kind of the last property, and only then the categories. And then we simply say equal restaurant. So that's exactly the same as with arrays. But now here we use the curly braces and we have to specify the name of the properties. But just like with arrays, this now creates 3 brand new variables. So based on this restaurant object. So let's see. Name, opening hours, and categories. And indeed, here they are. Okay, so that's the fundamentals of destructuring objects. And once again, this is an extremely useful addition to the language, especially when we deal with the result of an API call, which basically means to get data from another web application like weather data or data about movies or something like that. And this data usually comes in the form of objects, basically. And then destructuring is really a lifesaver. It allows us to write a lot less code. So this is really used in modern applications. But now, what if we wanted the variable names to be different from the property names? Well, we can do it like this. Now, of course, we still need to reference the property names like we did before. Otherwise, JavaScript has no way of knowing what we actually want. So let's write name again, but then we can use the colon and specify a new name. Let's say we actually want it to be called restaurant name. And then here, let's say we want the opening hours, but we want the variable to be called just hours. And then once again, we want to take the categories, but we want the variable name to be called tags. And then again, equal to restaurant. And so the variables that we now created are called restaurant name, hours, and tags. So basically this, and this. And VS Code is nice enough to put them in this purple color here too. And so you see that these 3 are actually the exact same name, but we were able to give them new variable names, which again is going to be immensely helpful when dealing with third-party data. And another useful feature for when we are dealing with third-party data like that, so like an object that we get from somewhere else, for example, an API call, as I was just explaining, it can be really useful to have default values for the case that we're trying to read a property that does not exist on the object. So usually then we get an undefined. For example, if we were trying to say restaurant dot menu, this would be undefined because there is no property called menu. We have starter menu and main menu, but not just menu. Okay, and so we can set default values just like we can actually in arrays. So let's say that we are trying to destructuring the menu, and so we use equal to set a default value. All right, and then we can do the same with the starter menu, for example, and then we can even combine this syntax here with what we did previously. So let me show you. So let's say that we're trying to retrieve the starter menu. So this one, but we then want to give it another name. So starter menu, and we want to call it just starters. And we also want to give it a default value in case it doesn't exist. So in this case, just an empty array. Now in this case, it actually does exist. So starter menu does exist. And so therefore this default value will not apply, but it should apply to menu. Because as I was just saying, there is no property on the restaurant object called menu. So menu and starters. And so here indeed we get the default value, which is the empty array. And here we get the starter menu. And without this, we would then get undefined, as I was saying. You see? And so this is a nice way of setting a default value. And once again, keep in mind that this is especially helpful when we do not have our data hard-coded like we have it here. So this is just hard-coded data in our application, but in the real world, we usually get the data from somewhere else. And then we might not always know how exactly the data looks like. And so then it's useful to set defaults like this. Next up, we need to talk about mutating variables while destructuring objects. So we did that before with arrays when we were switching variables. Remember that? So let's see. Down here, you see that we mutated these variables that we created before. But with objects, it works a little bit differently. And so let's write that here. Mutating variables. And here let's write default values. So let's say that we already have some variables here. So A and B. And then we have this object, which has a property A of 23, property B of 7, and C of 14, let's say. All right. And now we want to destructure this object. And actually, let's first store it into a variable. That makes it a bit easier to work with it. And so now actually let us destructure this array. Now we cannot say const like A, B, because A and B are already declared up here, right? We can also not do let, because again, that would create new variables and we already have them there. Okay, so here we are missing the object that we are destructuring. But as I was saying, we cannot do this. And so in fact, we want to mutate these variables. So A should become 23 and B should become 7. But now as we save this, watch what happens. And so we get a syntax error. And the reason for that is that when we start a line with a curly brace like this, then JavaScript expects a code block, all right? And since we cannot assign anything to a code block like we did here with the equal sign, then we get this error unexpected token with the equal there. So to solve this here, the trick is to wrap all of this into parentheses. And so that's the thing that I wanted to show you here. Okay, so now if we log A and B, it will work. So you see, now we get 23 and 7. So basically we did overwrite these two initial variables, but in order to do it, we had to wrap this destructuring assignment into parentheses. All right, and now we already know how object destructuring works, and so now we need to talk about nested objects, just like we did with nested arrays. So let's say we wanted to create two variables, open and close. And these should contain the open and close hours for Friday. Okay, so you see that opening hours is an object, and then in that object, we have another object. So this Friday is an object inside an object, which itself is inside the restaurant object. Okay, now the opening hours is already an object here that we have already stored in a variable. So that's the object that we're going to destructure. So nested objects. So again, we're going to start with opening hours, and now we want to retrieve Saturday. So let's start with doing that. So just Saturday for now. Or actually Friday. So I think I said Friday. So let's see. And so indeed, Friday is this object that we get here. But remember that we actually want two variables, one called open and the other one called close. And this is how that works. So we know that this is an object, and now we can further destructure that object using this syntax. So the colon, and then again the exact property name of that inner object. Okay, so that looks confusing, but that's just the syntax that we have to use. So maybe you don't even need to memorize this, but when you need this someday, and you will, then you can just come to this video and see how it works. And so indeed, now we get our numbers 11 and 23. And we could, of course, take this even further and even assign different variables to these, just like we did up here. So with the colon again. So we could call this one just O, and this one just C. So this is taking it to an extreme. But as I said in the beginning, destructuring is really powerful. So there's a lot of stuff we can do with it, and that's why I'm showing you all of it right now. Okay, and now to finish, let me actually show you a really cool practical application of this destructuring. And for that, we're going to go back to our object here. So to our example of this section, and now we will create another method. So many times in JavaScript, we have functions with a lot of parameters. And then it can be hard to know the order of parameters for someone that is using this function. And so instead of defining the parameters manually, we can just pass an object into the function as an argument, and the function will then immediately destructure that object. So let me show you what I mean. And let's say we want an order delivery. So that's a new function. Okay. And so here, let's just for now call this argument object. And then I will log that object to the console here. And now let me call this actually. And I will do it right here so that we can see everything at the same time. So that is restaurant.orderDelivery. And now here comes that object of options. So as I said, we can now specify some options here. Let's say the time of delivery. Let's set it to 23:30, which is like 10:30 p.m. Let's also say address Via del Sole 21. And then we also specify the main index and the start index. So a little bit like we did up here in this function, starter index. Okay. Oh, and here we need to also give it some value. Let's just say 2 as well. And so, yeah, here right at the beginning is that object that we just defined, because here we are simply logging it for now. Okay. So what we just did was to call this function here and passing in an object of options. And that's a pretty standard thing actually in JavaScript, especially in third-party libraries. Because now, here in the function arguments, we can actually do destructuring right away. So we can now say starter index, main index, time, and address, which is exactly the 4 property names that we have down here. And of course, usually we would first develop the function and then call it, but I wanted to explain you this way of calling a method with an object so that writing the object here then makes sense. All right, and so now instead of the object, since we did the structuring right here, we now actually have 4 variable names. So we can log them to the console, or actually let's do some nice string here. So let's say order received. And then let's get the food. So based on the starter index, let's just copy that from here. So this .starter menu at the current starter index, and then also the main menu. So let's again copy that, actually all of this from here. And we need the curly braces and this $sign will be delivered to, then the address, and then the time. Okay. And so indeed, we get this complete string based on the data that we passed in this single object. Okay, so that's important to realize. We only passed in one object into this function. Okay, we did not pass 4 arguments. It's really just one argument, one object. Then here in the function, as we receive that object, we do immediately destructuring. And so that's why these names here need to be exactly the names that we have down here in the object. But what's great about this is that here, the properties in the index don't have to match the order in which we do destructuring up here. And so that makes it really easy for the user of this function to specify basically the arguments. All right. So this is great, but we can even use some more knowledge that we gained here, which is these default values. So we can now use this to basically set defaults here on some of these. So let's say that the starter index will be 1 if it cannot be destructured, and that the main index will be 0 and the time will be 20 hours. And so now as we call this method, restaurant.orderDelivery, I can specify the address again. Let's actually copy it from here. And let me also just specify the starter index. Okay, but then the rest will be taken from the default values that we set here for destructuring. All right, and so here as a second string, we get will be delivered to Via del Sole at 20 hours. Okay, so in this object that we passed, we do not have any property for the time, right? And so then as JavaScript did destructuring, it here took the default value of 20. Okay, and the same happened for the main index that we also did define. So it shows 0, and 0 is pizza, and that's why we get pizza here in the output string. All right. So if you ever need to write a function like this, so a really complex one with a lot of parameters that might be then hard to specify, keep this technique in mind. And this becomes even more useful as the amount of parameters increases.